On my 35th birthday, I did not blow out candles surrounded by family. I stared at my phone while a cake I bought for myself melted under cheap frosting. On Facebook, my parents were cheering for my younger sister at the airport, filming her surprise trip to Santorini. My father commented, "She is the only one who makes us proud." My mother added a red heart. I did not cry. I did not comment. I smiled, opened my banking app, and initiated the process. I knew the banking protocols better than Gary ever would. I didn't just withdraw the money, I initiated a series of ACH transfers and scheduled wire payments, carefully structuring the amounts to stay within the daily limits to avoid immediate red flags, but fast enough to empty the account before they returned from Santorini. By the time the bank's fraud department would think to call, I would be the one answering the phone, confirming every transaction as the primary account holder. That was the moment everything changed, whether my family was ready or not. Have you ever felt like the invisible one in your own family? Like your entire existence was just a background for someone else's highlight reel? Drop a comment and let me know where you are listening from and what time it is for you right now. I would love to know who is part of our community. Anger was not loud this time, it was clinical. I sat at my small kitchen table in my Chicago apartment, the one that always smelled faintly of detergent and burned coffee, watching the blue light of my laptop screen wash over the remains of my 35th birthday. Outside, the city traffic hummed, indifferent to the fact that my internal balance sheet had just hit zero. My mind, trained for years to find discrepancies in complex ledgers, simply closed the file on family. I looked at the joint account balance, $85,432. It wasn't just money. It was 4 years of my life they had stolen with lies. I didn't feel sad. I felt focused. For 4 years, I had been the silent investor in their version of family, footing the bill for every phantom heart palpitation and every unverified specialist visit. I had treated my compassion as a fixed expense, a luxury they had overdrafted for years. But as I scrolled through the transaction history, the numbers began to tell a different story. Line by line, the fraud revealed itself with lethal precision. There was a charge from a boutique for $4,200 a wedding dress deposit, a series of transfers for international airfare totaling $7,000, a hotel reservation in Santorini labeled as Dad's Recovery Retreat. Recovery? No. This was a gift from my sister, Destiny. My $85,000 was not keeping the lights on in my parents' house. It was funding a sun-drenched fairy tale I was not even invited to attend. I rubbed my eyes, trying to summon a single shred of regret, but there was only clarity. This was not a family crisis. It was a bad contract, and I was finally reading the fine print. I had been trained as a senior auditor to look for discrepancies, to find the hidden leaks in a system and plug them. My father's comment on Facebook, the one declaring Destiny as their only pride, was the final audit report I needed. They were not shocked by the cruelty of their words. They were just comfortable with my silence. I moved the cursor to the transfer button. My hands were steady. My mind was as sharp as a razor. I entered the amount, $85,000. The exact sum of my life's work, my nights of overtime, and my sacrificed vacations. I clicked confirm. The screen refreshed. The process had officially begun. The countdown to zero had started. In its place, my personal savings account glowed with a different kind of sunrise, the kind made of facts, numbers, and quiet retribution. The money did not disappear all at once. It would move in pieces over the next few days. But the decision was instant and irreversible. I looked at the melting cupcake and its crooked icing. I did not make a wish. I simply closed the laptop. The subscription to my family's drama had officially expired, and I was no longer footing the bill. It was 12:03 a.m. Exactly. 12 minutes had passed since that Facebook notification incinerated 35 years of loyalty. In those 12 minutes, I did not pace, and I did not reach for a bottle of wine. I sat perfectly still, my fingers hovering over the keys of my laptop like a surgeon preparing for the first incision. I should have been shaking. That is what the movies tell you happens when your world collapses. You slide down a wall or break a glass. But as I stared at the flickering blue light of my banking portal, I felt a strange, icy stillness. This was not a breakdown. It was a liquidation. For over a decade, I had been the silent investor in the Gary and Stephanie Henderson brand. I had treated our relationship as a partnership, but the records showed it was actually a hostile takeover, with me footing the bill for my own erasure. I pulled up a blank spreadsheet. As a senior auditor, I know that people lie, but numbers remain objective. I began my own private audit of the last 4 years. I pulled every email Gary had sent me, the ones that always started with a description of his chest pains and ended with the request for another $2,000. I cross referenced those dates with the joint account's transaction history. The discrepancies were lethal. On the same day I sent $3,000 for a cardiac specialist, there was a charge for $2,800 at a high end bridal salon in downtown Chicago. When I sent $5,000 for uncovered surgery costs, the account showed a 5-night deposit at a luxury resort in Santorini. The math was simple. I had been subsidizing a lifestyle I was never invited to share. My $85,000 was the fuel for Destiny's fairy tale, while I lived in a studio apartment that smelled like burned coffee and old detergent. My compassion had been a luxury resource they had overdrafted until the account was bone dry. I did not call them. I did not ask for an explanation. Why would I give them the chance to draft more fiction? I simply initiated the first wave of transfers. I moved $20,000, then another $20,000. I watched the numbers migrate from the joint account, the one they treated like a personal lottery, into my private, encrypted trust. 12:07 a.m. The screen blinked. Transfer in progress. I felt a phantom weight lift off my shoulders. For years, I had carried the responsibility of their survival, convinced that if I stopped, the family would collapse. I realize now that the family was already a ruin. I was just the one paying for the scaffolding to keep the facade standing. My father's comment on Facebook kept echoing in my head. She is the only one who makes us proud. It was a clear breach of contract. I was no longer an investor. I was a debt collector. I watched the progress bar crawl across the screen, reclaiming $85,000 of my life's work. The lights of the Chicago skyscrapers outside my window looked like data points on a global graph, distant, cold, and precise. I realized then that they were not shocked by what they had done. They were only going to be shocked that I had stopped playing along. The final confirmation appeared. Balance, $0. Over the next 3 days, as each scheduled transfer cleared, the weight of their expectations finally vanished. For the first time in 35 years, I wasn't an unpaid creditor to my own parents. The debt was settled, not with their money, but with my freedom. The mourning was no longer a burden. It was a clean slate. For 35 years, I had lived in the negative space of my sister's spotlight. In the Henderson household, the rules were never written down, but they were as solid as a balance sheet. Destiny was the delicate flower that needed constant watering, and I was the root system expected to find its own nutrients while being stepped on. The erasure was not a sudden event. It was an accumulation of small, quiet thefts. It was the piano lessons Destiny demanded and quit after 2 months, while I was told my auditing degree was too dry to merit a single tuition check. I worked 3 jobs, barista, night clerk, and library assistant to pay for the very skills I was now using to dismantle their deception. My father, Gary, used to call my self-sufficiency strength, but as an auditor, I now recognize that for what it truly was, a narrative convenience. By labeling me the strong one, they granted themselves permission to ignore my needs while treating my bank account as an emergency fund with a 0% interest rate. This is the trap of normalizing cruelty. In families like mine, the reliable child is slowly transformed into a resource rather than a human being. Because I never screamed, they assumed I was not bleeding. They did not feel like they were stealing from me. They felt like they were simply relocating assets from a surplus to a need. Destiny was the need perpetually fragile, perpetually finding herself on my dime. I remember the first heart scare 4 years ago. Gary had called me, his voice a practiced tremor, claiming the deductible for his specialist was $3,000. I did not hesitate. I wired the money within 10 minutes. That was the day the subscription began. My compassion became a monthly bill I paid to maintain the illusion of a family that loved me. Every time I reached a financial milestone, a promotion or a bonus, Gary's health would conveniently take a turn for the worse. I had been funding a lifestyle of designer bags and Santorini sunsets under the guise of life saving medical care. The pride they felt for Destiny was not earned. It was bought and paid for with $85,000 of my life. They saw me as an ATM machine that did not require maintenance, a source of stability they could overdraft without consequence. But they forgot one fundamental rule of accounting. When the investor realizes there is no return on the asset, they liquidate. I looked at the transaction record one last time, the flight to Greece, the hotel, the boutique shopping. The strong child was done being a safety net for people who only acknowledged my existence when the bill was due. This was not a family dynamic anymore, it was a bad debt I was finally writing off. The silence lasted exactly 48 hours. Then, the emotional blackmail began. It was not a slow trickle, it was a flood. My phone, which had been blissfully quiet on my birthday, now screamed with notifications every few minutes. I did not answer a single one. I watched the screen light up with Gary's name, then Stephanie's, then Destiny's, over and over until the vibration hummed against the wood of my desk like a trapped insect. The first email from my mother arrived with a subject line in all caps: "We need to talk." I opened it during my lunch break, sitting in my car with the engine off while the Chicago sun beat against the windshield. She did not ask how my 35th year was starting. She did not mention the cupcake or the silence. Instead, she wrote about unbearable stress and failing health. She said my father had not slept since he saw the balance hit zero. She described my sister, Destiny, as emotionally fragile and devastated that her dream wedding was being held hostage by my selfishness. The word apology appeared 3 times. The word money appeared 7. I read it with the detachment of an auditor reviewing a fraudulent expense report. My compassion had been a luxury they had overdrafted for years, and now that the credit line was closed, they were panicking. They were not grieving a lost relationship. They were grieving a lost revenue stream. Gary's email came an hour later. It was shorter and sharper. He called me a vindictive child and a traitor to the family. He claimed that the $85,000 was part of a safety net we had agreed upon. He forgot to mention that the safety net was supposed to be for his survival, not for Destiny's Instagram aesthetic in Santorini. He ended the message by saying I would be responsible for whatever happened to his heart next. I did not argue. I did not defend myself. I knew that in their eyes, setting a boundary was an act of war. Everything stayed silent for days after I ignored their initial blast. But in my head, their words kept echoing not as truth, but as data. I stopped checking in on them every morning. I stopped checking their weather. I stopped being the root system for their toxic garden. Instead, I went to work. I used my professional access to start a systematic review of every medical bill Gary had sent me over the last 2 years. I looked at the provider codes and the insurance claim numbers. My internal transformation was subtle. I was not the same person who had clicked send on those monthly transfers anymore. I was now the lead auditor of my own life. I contacted a source in medical billing, a friend who understood the nuances of insurance fraud. I did not tell her it was about my father. I told her I was investigating a discrepancy in a private account. As I compiled the records, the air in my apartment felt thinner, cleaner. The silence was no longer a punishment they were inflicting on me. It was a perimeter I had established to keep them out. I stared at the growing folder of evidence on my desktop. Calm, factual, lethal. The audit was complete. It did not end with a dramatic confrontation or a tearful confession. It ended with a single PDF document sent to my private email at 2:15 a.m. My contact in medical billing had come through, and the reality was more devastating than any Facebook comment. I sat in the dark, the glow of the screen reflecting off my glasses, and read the line that changed everything. My father's surgery, the one he claimed had left them with $30,000 in uncovered debt, had been paid in full by his primary insurance and a secondary policy 2 years ago. Every specialist visit, every medication, every follow-up covered. Total out-of-pocket cost for Gary Henderson, $0. My chest felt hollow, not with sadness, but with the cold realization of a systemic betrayal. For 2 years, my parents had not just been ungrateful. They had been running a criminal enterprise. They had meticulously forged invoices, altered hospital logos, and drafted fake balance due statements. They did not just take my $85,000, they embezzled it under the guise of life saving care. I pulled up one of the bills Gary had emailed me last November. He had claimed the hospital was threatening to send his cardiac account to collections unless I sent $5,000 immediately. I cross referenced it with the actual hospital ledger. The account had been closed for months. The $5,000 I sent did not go to a debt collector. It was the exact amount Gary and Stephanie used to pay for the first class upgrades for Destiny's flight to Santorini. This was the insurance ghost, a phantom debt created to harvest my labor. They had not just used my money for luxury trips, they had lied about a man's health to manipulate his daughter into subsidizing a lifestyle they could not afford. It was a deliberate, calculated fraud. I stared at the "for being you" transfer to Destiny's account. That $1,000 gift I had been guilted into sending during my failing father's recovery was actually just my own hard-earned money, being laundered through my mother's emotional manipulation. They were not just bad parents. They were criminals. I did not reach for the phone. I did not send a screaming text. I simply created a new folder on my encrypted drive titled Fraud Documentation. I uploaded every fake invoice they had ever sent me alongside the actual insurance statements. I didn't stop at just saving the files. I sent this audit package to the insurance company's Special Investigations Unit. I included proof that Gary had been double dipping, claiming state disability benefits while billing private insurance for treatments that cost him nothing. I triggered a federal audit. The hundreds of thousands they would eventually owe weren't just to me. They were to the government and the insurers, with penalties and interest that my father's pride could never cover. I felt a strange sense of liberation as the files uploaded. The guilt they had spent decades wiring into my brain was being systematically erased by the weight of evidence. I do not remember how long I sat there. All I know is that by the time the sun started to rise over the Chicago skyline, I was not the same person anymore. The reliable daughter was gone. The strong child had officially resigned. This was not a family drama anymore. It was a balance sheet, and I was about to enforce the final collection. I looked at the $85,000 now sitting securely in my personal account. They had tried to write me out of their story, but they forgot that, as the auditor, I was the one who held the pen. The phone call from Santorini came at 3:42 a.m. Chicago time. It was Destiny, and the polished, effortless voice from her Instagram stories was gone, replaced by a shrill, jagged panic. "Claire, you have to do something," she sobbed, the sound of wind and distant Greek music cutting through the line. The card was declined. At the rehearsal dinner, in front of Gregory's parents. "They are looking at us like we are criminals, Claire. Dad is white as a sheet." I sat up in bed, my back against the cold headboard, and did not offer a single word of comfort. I knew exactly where they were, the most expensive restaurant on the Caldera, where the wine costs more than my monthly rent, and the view is reserved for the elite. For years, my family had walked through the world with an unearned confidence, assuming the floor would never drop out because I was always there to catch them. "I am sure it is just an issue with the account," I said, my voice as flat as a dial tone. "They will not let us leave the restaurant, Claire." Dad tried to explain his health issues, but Gregory's father just walked away. "They think we are fraudsters. Just send $10,000, please. I will pay you back when we get home." I looked at the audit report on my nightstand. "Destiny, why would you need $10,000? Dad told me the insurance covered everything. He should have plenty of savings." Silence. The kind of heavy, suffocating silence that occurs when a lie finally runs out of oxygen. This was the illusion of power from an empty wallet. My family had built their entire identity on a foundation of luxury they had not earned. They wore the clothes, took the trips, and looked down on my boring life, all while using my $85,000 as the engine for their performance. Their status was not a reflection of their character. It was a shell they had rented with my labor. And now that the rent was due and the ATM machine had stopped spitting out cash, the shell was cracking. "I cannot help you, Destiny," I said. "I am busy finishing an audit." I hung up before she could scream. Everything stayed silent for days after that. No one used their golden child heart emojis anymore. When they finally returned to Chicago, they did not go to their luxury townhouse. They came straight to my apartment. Gary and Stephanie stood at my door, looking diminished. My father did not look like a man with a heart condition. He looked like a man who had been caught. His skin was sallow, and the aura of authority he had used to command my bank account had completely vanished. Claire, my mother began, her voice cracking as she tried to play the victim one last time. The humiliation. Destiny's wedding is ruined. Gregory's family called off the merger. How could you be so cruel? I did not invite them in. I stood in the doorway and handed Gary a manila envelope containing the evidence of his insurance fraud and the forged invoices. I am not being cruel, Stephanie, I said, addressing her by her name for the first time in my life. I am being accurate. You used $85,000 of my money to fund a lie while Dad's bills were already paid. This is not a family dispute. This is a restitution. Gary looked at the documents, his hands shaking. He tried to summon his old anger, but there was no money behind it anymore, no leverage to hold over my head. He realized that the daughter he had erased was the only thing that had been keeping his world from falling apart. "We will lose the house," he whispered. "I know," I replied coldly. "I suggest you look for something more realistic." I closed the door and locked the deadbolt. The power had officially flipped. The silent cash cow had finally left the barn, and she was taking the barn with her. I did not tell them where I was going. On the day I packed the last box, Chicago was drenched in a pale, unforgiving autumn sun. I left the studio apartment that always smelled like burned coffee and laundry detergent behind, and I did not look back once. The $85,000 I had recovered was much more than just a digit on a digital screen. It was the literal price of my liberation. I used a portion of that money to secure a down payment for a small, quiet condo with floor-to-ceiling windows that looked directly over Lake Michigan. The first morning in my new home, there was no noise, there was no vibrating phone on the nightstand, no desperate emails, and no phantom heart scares from my father demanding my paycheck. I stood by the glass and watched the water. It was vast, deep, and entirely indifferent to the small, petty drama of the Henderson family. It was beautiful. Justice arrived through the slow, grinding gears of the legal system, exactly as I had planned in my final audit. Once the insurance companies were presented with the undeniable evidence of the forged invoices, the matter was no longer just a private family dispute. Gary and Stephanie were forced to sell their pristine colonial house to pay back the hundreds of thousands of dollars they had skimmed from the healthcare hardship funds over the years. They ended up moving into a cramped two-bedroom apartment on the far side of the city, a place far less sophisticated than the world they had tried to build on my back. Destiny's world crumbled even faster than the house. The family of the man she was supposed to marry did not want anything to do with the family under federal investigation for fraud. Her Santorini fairy tale became a local scandal, a perfect case study for the illusion of power from an empty wallet. The status they had performed was nothing more than a shell they had rented with my labor, and now the lease was over. Destiny stopped posting selfies. There are no more heart emojis under pins about her perfect life. As for me, I finally finished that logistics certification. I stepped into a leadership track at my firm, not because I was the reliable one who could handle everyone else's stress, but because I was the most capable person in the room. I realized that for 35 years, I had been trying to be a hero for people who only saw me as a resource. I was the root system that kept their toxic garden blooming, but in my new life, I am the only person I need to nourish. And now, I want to speak directly to you, to the ones who are always the designated strong child. To the ones who pay the bills, keep the secrets, and carry the weight of a family that never bothers to ask how you are truly doing. I want to send you this message. Your worth is not a transaction. You are not an ATM machine for the people who claim to love you while they systematically erase your existence. If you are sitting in the dark right now, wondering what you did wrong to deserve being overlooked, understand this. The problem was never your lack of value. The problem was their entitled greed. Setting a boundary is not an act of cruelty. It is an act of survival. You do not need to be the hero who saves everyone else while you drown in absolute silence. You deserve to be seen, You deserve a morning where the only noise is the sound of your own peace. Thank you for listening to the story of the Henderson family. Don't let your kindness be exploited by those who only see you as a tool. If this story resonated with you, please share it so we can spread the value of self respect together. Click subscribe to make sure you do not miss our next lessons on justice and inner strength.